It usually happens late at night, not during the busy parts of the day, not while you're answering messages or finishing tasks, but during those quiet moments when everything finally slows down. You're lying in bed, your phone screen goes dark, the room is silent, and suddenly, a strange thought appears. A memory of a version of yourself you haven't thought about in a long time. The person you once imagined becoming. Not the person you are now, but the person you once believed you might become. Maybe it was when you were younger. Maybe it was during a moment in your early 20s. Back then, your life didn't feel fully defined yet. You had ideas, curiosity, a sense that the future could unfold in many directions. You imagined certain things about your life, not just success, but meaning, a life that felt alive, a direction that felt like it belonged to you. But somewhere along the way, life became more structured, responsibilities appeared, expectations grew stronger, decisions became more practical, more logical, more responsible, and slowly, almost without noticing it, that earlier version of yourself faded into the background. Not because you rejected it, not because you consciously gave it up, but because life kept moving forward. Deadlines, opportunities, responsibilities, momentum. And one day you look at your life and realize something strange. Your life works. It functions. It moves forward. But the person you once imagined becoming is no longer clearly visible inside it. And that realization leads to a quiet question. Not a dramatic one, just a simple, honest thought that appears in the silence. When did I forget who I was trying to become? The strange thing about losing direction in life is that it almost never happens suddenly. People don't wake up one morning and decide to forget who they were becoming. It happens slowly, so slowly that most people never notice it while it's happening. At first, the changes are small. You make a practical decision, a responsible one. You choose the option that feels safe, the opportunity that makes sense, the path that seems stable. None of these choices feel wrong. In fact, they often feel intelligent. But life has a way of building momentum. Every decision creates a new set of expectations, a new structure, a new direction. And once that direction begins forming, it becomes easier to keep moving forward than to stop and question where it leads. So people continue. They adapt. They adjust. They become more responsible, more practical, more efficient. Over time, the decisions that once felt temporary start becoming permanent. A career becomes a routine. Responsibilities become identity. Momentum becomes direction. And the more life begins functioning smoothly, the less reason people feel they have to question it. After all, everything seems to be working. Life is stable. Progress is visible. Responsibilities are handled. But something subtle is happening beneath the surface. The version of yourself you once imagined becoming is no longer guiding your direction. Instead, your direction is guided by momentum, deadlines, opportunities, expectations, none of which are inherently bad. But momentum has a quiet side effect. It rarely asks whether the path still belongs to you. It simply keeps moving forward. And after enough years pass this way, many people suddenly notice something strange. They know exactly how their life works, but they're not entirely sure when they stop choosing its direction. When people start noticing that they've drifted away from who they once imagined becoming, they often assume something strange happened along the way. Maybe they made the wrong choices. Maybe they lost their ambition. Maybe they simply changed. But the truth is usually much quieter than that. Most people didn't lose themselves. They simply stopped paying attention to themselves. This is something the psychologist Carl Jung understood deeply when he described the idea of the persona. The persona is the version of yourself you present to the world. Your professional self, your responsible self, your capable self. It is the identity that allows you to function inside society. Without the persona, social life would be chaotic. People need roles. Roles help us cooperate with systems. They help us navigate responsibilities. They help us build stable lives. So developing a persona is not a problem. In fact, it's necessary. But Jung noticed something important. Problems begin when a person spends too much time inside that role. When the role becomes so dominant that it slowly replaces the deeper self beneath it. Because beneath the persona, there is another version of you. The version that existed before the world told you what mattered. Your curiosity, your natural interests, your personal sense of meaning, the questions that once guided your imagination. Those parts of you don't disappear, but they can become quieter over time, especially in environments where performance is constantly rewarded. When your career demands focus, you give attention to your role. When responsibilities increase, you give attention to stability. When expectations grow stronger, you give attention to reliability, and attention shapes identity. The parts of your life that receive attention grow stronger. The parts that receive less attention slowly fade into the background. Not permanently, but quietly. Like a conversation that gradually becomes harder to hear. Over time, the persona becomes extremely refined. You become skilled at navigating your responsibilities. You become good at performing your role. You become reliable, productive, capable. From the outside, this looks like maturity. It looks like success. It looks like someone who has their life together. But inside the mind, something subtle can begin happening. The deeper self beneath the persona receives less and less attention. Not because you rejected it, not because you consciously abandoned it, but because life demanded your attention somewhere else. Responsibilities, deadlines, pressure, momentum. All of these forces pull attention outward. And when attention stays outward long enough, the inner voice becomes quieter. Not gone, just quieter. This is why many people eventually experience a strange moment in life. A moment where they pause long enough to notice something unsettling. They know exactly how their life works. They know their responsibilities. They know their routines. They know how to function effectively inside their role. But they are not entirely sure who they are outside of that role anymore. That realization can feel confusing because nothing is technically wrong. The career works. Life continues moving forward. But something feels slightly unfamiliar, almost like watching your life from a small distance. And when that feeling appears, many people assume they need to fix themselves. They assume they need more motivation, more discipline, more gratitude. But the deeper explanation is often much simpler. The version of you that once guided your direction was never destroyed. It was simply neglected, like a path in a forest that slowly becomes overgrown when no one walks on it anymore. The path still exists, but it becomes harder to see, harder to follow, harder to remember. Until one day, something reminds you that it was there. A memory, a thought, a quiet moment of reflection. And suddenly you remember something you had almost forgotten. You once had a very clear sense of the kind of person you wanted to become. Not a perfect plan, but a direction, a feeling, a sense of meaning. And when that memory returns, it creates a powerful realization. You didn't lose yourself. You simply stopped listening to yourself. And once you understand that, something surprising happens. The distance between you and that forgotten version of yourself no longer feels permanent. Because if something was forgotten, it can also be remembered. If forgetting who you were becoming were simply a personal failure, then it would be rare. But it isn't. In fact, it happens to an extraordinary number of people. People who are intelligent, capable, disciplined. People who work hard. People who do exactly what they were told would lead to a good life. Yet many of those same people eventually experience a quiet realization. Somewhere along the way, they drifted away from themselves. This raises an important question. If so many capable people experience this same feeling, maybe the explanation is not purely personal. Maybe it is structural. Modern life is built around systems that organize attention. Your attention determines what you think about. What you think about determines how you behave. And how you behave slowly shapes the direction of your life. But modern systems rarely organize attention around reflection. Instead, they organize attention around urgency, notifications, deadlines, responsibilities, productivity, the next task, the next message, the next problem that requires your focus. Every one of these things pulls your attention outward. None of them are malicious. In fact, they are often necessary. Societies require coordination. Organizations require efficiency. Responsibilities require focus. But there is a hidden cost to living inside a system that constantly pulls attention outward. Your inner world receives less and less attention. The questions that once guided your identity become quieter. The curiosity that once shaped your direction becomes less visible because attention is limited. The more of it that is consumed by external pressure, the less remains available for internal reflection. This is one of the reasons many people feel strangely disconnected later in life. They spent years becoming extremely effective at responding to external demands, but very little time asking internal questions. An identity grows where attention lives. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote something remarkably insightful about the human mind. He observed that a person's life becomes what their thoughts repeatedly return to. This means attention is not just a mental resource. It is the architect of identity. Whatever consistently occupies your attention slowly becomes the structure of your life. If your attention is constantly directed toward performance, your identity becomes organized around performance. If your attention is constantly reacting to pressure, your identity becomes organized around survival. And if your attention never pauses long enough to explore deeper meaning, then meaning begins fading from the experience of daily life. Not because meaning disappeared, but because attention never stops long enough to encounter it. This is why modern life can create a strange paradox. Many people are more productive than any generation before them. They are organized, efficient, capable. Yet at the same time, many of those same people feel strangely disconnected from themselves. They function extremely well inside systems, but feel less connected to their own direction. Because the system rarely asks the question that matters most. It asks, what should you achieve next? What should you optimize next? What should you accomplish next? But it rarely asks, who are you becoming while you pursue those things? That question requires a different kind of attention, a slower kind, the kind that appears during quiet moments, during reflection, during long walks, during evenings when the mind finally stops reacting to pressure. Those are the moments where people begin noticing something they haven't looked at in years. Their direction, not their tasks, not their responsibilities, their direction. And when someone finally pauses long enough to examine that direction, the realization can feel both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling because they may notice how much of their life was shaped by external forces. Liberating because they suddenly realize something else. Direction is not permanent. Momentum can always be questioned. Paths can be adjusted. Attention can be reclaimed. The Stoics understood this very clearly. They believed that while we cannot control every external event, we always retain control over our awareness, where the mind rests, what the mind reflects on, what the mind chooses to value. And once someone begins reclaiming that awareness, something subtle begins changing. They stop living purely through reaction. They begin living through observation. They notice which parts of life feel authentic, which parts feel inherited, which parts still align with the person they are becoming. And once that awareness appears, something interesting begins happening. The forgotten self begins returning, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, through attention, through reflection, through the simple act of asking questions that the system rarely asks. Questions like, what parts of my life actually feel meaningful? What parts of my identity were shaped by expectation? What parts still belong to me? These questions do not immediately change someone's life, but they do something equally powerful. They reopen the conversation between you and yourself, a conversation that may have been silent for many years. And the moment that conversation begins again, something remarkable happens. You realize that the version of yourself you thought you lost was never truly gone. It was simply waiting for your attention to return. Once a person realizes that their attention shaped their direction, something unexpected often begins happening. Memories return. Not dramatic memories, not life-changing moments, but small fragments of the person they used to be, a thought they once had, a dream they once considered, an interest that once felt important. These memories rarely appear during busy moments. They appear when life slows down, during quiet evenings, long drives, late-night walks, moments when the mind finally stops reacting to the world. And when those memories appear, they often bring a strange feeling with them, recognition, almost like meeting a version of yourself you haven't seen in years. You suddenly remember things you had completely forgotten, the questions you used to ask, the things that once fascinated you, the kind of life you once imagined, not necessarily a specific career, not necessarily a perfect plan, but a feeling, a sense that life could unfold in a direction that felt deeply personal. For many people, those early visions were not unrealistic. They were simply unprotected. Life became louder, responsibilities became heavier, and the quiet voice of personal curiosity slowly faded into the background. But something interesting happens when that voice begins returning. You start realizing something important. The version of yourself you thought you lost was never actually destroyed. It was simply buried beneath years of adaptation. Think about how habits form. When you repeat a behavior long enough, it becomes automatic. Your mind stops questioning it. Your body simply continues the pattern. Life works in a similar way. Years of routines create psychological momentum. You wake up, you work, you solve problems, you handle responsibilities. And because the routine works, the mind stops asking deeper questions. But once awareness interrupts that routine, the mind becomes curious again. And curiosity has a powerful effect on identity. It begins reopening doors you thought were closed. You start remembering interests that once felt meaningful, ideas you once explored, paths you once considered. Some of them may no longer fit your life. Others might still feel surprisingly alive. And that discovery often surprises people because they assumed those parts of themselves were gone forever. But identity does not disappear that easily. It waits, sometimes quietly, sometimes patiently, but it waits for attention. And the moment attention returns, those parts of the self slowly become visible again. This is why remembering who you once wanted to become can feel strangely emotional. It reconnects you with a version of yourself that existed before years of adaptation shaped your life. A version of yourself that was not yet fully influenced by expectations. A version that was curious, explorative, open. This does not mean that version of you had all the answers, but it often had something extremely valuable. Honesty. Honesty about what felt meaningful. Honesty about what felt exciting. Honesty about what felt worth pursuing. And once that honesty becomes visible again, something begins shifting inside the mind. You stop looking at your life purely through the lens of obligation. You begin looking at it through the lens of alignment. Not asking, what do I have to do next? But asking, what parts of my life still feel true to me? This question changes everything because it transforms life from a routine you maintain into a direction you participate in. It reminds you that identity is not fixed. It is shaped by attention, by reflection, by the choices you make about what matters. And when someone begins reconnecting with that forgotten self, a new realization begins forming. The goal is not to return to the past. You cannot become the exact person you once imagined. Life has changed. You have changed, but something else becomes possible. You can reconnect with the direction that version of you was pointing toward. And that direction may still be waiting for you. Once people begin remembering the version of themselves they once imagined becoming, a natural question appears. What now? Should they abandon everything they built? Should they change their life completely? Should they try to go back to who they used to be? But the truth is much simpler than that. Rediscovering yourself is not about returning to the past. The past cannot be recreated. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago. Your life has evolved. Your responsibilities are real. Your experiences have shaped you. And none of that needs to be erased. What matters is not becoming your past self again. What matters is reconnecting with the direction that self was pointing toward. Because that direction often contains something deeply authentic, not a detailed life plan, but a sense of meaning, a sense of curiosity, a sense of aliveness. And those qualities do not belong to the past. They belong to attention. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote something powerful that many people overlook. He believed that your life becomes what your mind repeatedly returns to. This means identity is not something fixed. It is something continuously shaped by attention. Every day your mind chooses what it focuses on. Responsibilities, tasks, expectations, problems. All of these are necessary parts of life. But if attention lives only in those places, identity slowly becomes organized around survival. Life becomes functional, efficient, stable, but sometimes less alive. However, something changes when attention begins returning to deeper questions. Questions like, what actually feels meaningful to me? What parts of my life feel aligned with who I am becoming? What parts feel inherited from expectations? These questions do not instantly transform someone's life, but they begin transforming something far more important: awareness. And awareness changes how you interact with your life. Instead of moving purely through momentum, you begin making conscious adjustments, small ones, quiet ones. You may not change your entire career. You may not redesign your life overnight, but you start making decisions with a different kind of attention. You begin protecting the parts of life that feel meaningful. You begin creating space for curiosity again. You begin reconnecting with interests that once made you feel alive. And something subtle happens when people do this. Their life begins feeling more personal again. Not perfect, not effortless, but personal, because they are no longer living purely inside the script. They are participating in the direction. This is the quiet power of awareness. It does not demand dramatic change. It invites intentional change. And over time, those small shifts reshape something very important: identity. Not the persona you perform for the world, but the deeper identity that emerges from the choices you make about what matters. And when someone begins living from that place, a realization slowly appears. The person you thought you lost may actually still be becoming. Once people begin reconnecting with the direction that once mattered to them, something subtle begins changing in the way they see their life. They stop asking the question that dominated their thinking for so many years. What should I achieve next? And they begin asking something deeper. What kind of person am I becoming while I pursue these things? At first, this shift feels small, almost philosophical. But over time, it transforms the way a person experiences life. Because achievement measures what you accomplish, but identity measures who you become. And those two things are not always the same. For years, many people organize their life around external milestones. Career progress, financial stability, recognition, status. None of these things are meaningless. They can bring security. They can bring opportunities. But they do not automatically answer the deeper question of identity. A person can achieve many things and still feel disconnected from themselves. Not because success is empty, but because success does not automatically align with meaning. Meaning emerges from a different place. It emerges from alignment, from the quiet sense that the direction of your life reflects something genuine about who you are. This is why rediscovering your forgotten self can feel so powerful. It reconnects you with the internal compass that once guided you. Not a perfect compass, but an honest one, the kind that points toward curiosity, toward meaning, toward experiences that feel real. And once that compass becomes visible again, life begins feeling less mechanical. You still work. You still handle responsibilities. You still navigate the structures of modern life. But something inside the experience changes. You begin living with awareness. You notice which parts of your life energize you. You notice which parts feel purely automatic. You notice where your attention naturally wants to return. And slowly, without dramatic announcements or radical changes, your direction begins adjusting, not toward perfection, but toward authenticity. You begin shaping a life that contains more of yourself inside it. And this is where many people discover something surprising. The version of yourself you thought you lost was never actually a finished identity. It was a direction, a signal pointing toward who you were capable of becoming. And that direction never truly disappears. It simply becomes quieter when life grows louder. But the moment you begin listening again, that direction becomes visible. Not as nostalgia, but as possibility. Because identity is not something you discover once and keep forever. It is something you continuously shape, through attention, through reflection, through the decisions you make about what matters. And when people begin seeing their life this way, something powerful happens. They stop believing that they missed their chance. They stop believing that the person they once hoped to become is gone. Instead, they begin understanding something deeper. Identity is not behind them. It is ahead of them. It is the person they are still becoming. And once you understand that, life begins to feel different. Less like a script you must follow, and more like a direction you are allowed to shape. But that realization opens an even deeper question, one that very few people stop long enough to explore. If you are still becoming someone, then what kind of person are you becoming right now? Because the answer to that question may quietly shape the rest of your life. And if this question feels familiar to you, you may want to explore the other conversations on this channel. Because many people today are not searching for motivation. They are searching for clarity. Clarity about identity. Clarity about meaning. Clarity about how to live in a world that constantly tries to decide who they should become. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply pause long enough to remember who you are becoming.